They say that Coco Chanel once proclaimed, "I don't do fashion, I am fashion." It's a bold statement, almost shockingly self-assured, but it hints at why, even decades after her passing, Chanel's name remains a synonym for timeless style. What many people don't realize is that she came from practically nothing and rose through grit, talent, and sheer force of will to become the face of modern fashion. And yes, even though she wasn't your typical Hollywood star, she had a profound impact on the film industry and mingled in the highest circles of American cinema. From designing on-screen costumes to forging friendships with Tinseltown's brightest names, she made her mark on Hollywood in her own distinctive way. But the path that led her there was neither straightforward nor free from controversy. In fact, some of her greatest strengths, her ambition, her single-mindedness, would also pull her into scandals and moral ambiguities that still spark debate today. Coco Chanel was born Gabrielle Bonheur Chanel on August 19, 1883, in Saumur, France. The era was a time of stark social divisions, when the wealthy and the aristocratic lived in enviable splendor, and families of modest means struggled for basic comfort. France was still recovering from the Franco-Prussian War of the previous decade, and the social fabric was frayed. Many families found themselves constantly on the move, chasing work or new opportunities. Gabrielle was the second daughter in a large brood, and her early family life was anything but stable. Her father, Albert Chanel, was an itinerant street vendor who sold work clothes and undergarments, often traveling from town to town. Her mother, Jeanne Devol, had little means to provide much in the way of nurturing or financial stability. This unstable environment only grew more precarious when Gabrielle was about 12 years old. Her mother passed away from tuberculosis, an event that thrust the family into crisis. Her father, unable or unwilling to care for his children, placed Gabrielle and two of her sisters in a convent orphanage called Aubazine in the region of Corrèze. Imagine the shock for a girl raised amid the clamor of markets and town squares, suddenly finding herself in a stony religious institution where discipline and humility were the guiding principles. The convent's daily routines were strict: early morning prayers, chores, needlework lessons, and a reserved kind of silence that left little room for childlike laughter. Yet there was a silver lining hidden in that rather bleak setting. The nuns taught her how to sew, a skill that would become the bedrock of her life's work. She also developed a love for simplicity in dress. The convent's stark black and white habits, the bare halls, and the subdued environment shaped her aesthetic preferences, instilling in her the idea that elegance often arises from restraint rather than flamboyance. Those formative years introduced a thread of minimalism into her soul, later influencing her design so profoundly that the world of women's fashion would never be the same. When she aged out of the convent's care, Gabrielle's future was hardly guaranteed. For a time, she tried her hand at being a cabaret singer in provincial towns like Moulins and Vichy, earning spare change and dreaming of a life that would rescue her from poverty. It was during these early singing gigs that she reportedly picked up the nickname Coco, though the exact origins of it vary depending on who's telling the story. Some say it stemmed from the little song she sang about a lost dog named Coco. Others claim it was a shorthand for the French word for darling, which her admirers would coo at her. Regardless of the origin, the name stuck and she would keep it, weaving it into an aura that set her apart from other young women who simply vanished into domestic life. In the early 1900s, France was on the cusp of radical cultural change. Artists like Picasso were redefining art. New technologies were transforming everyday life, and women were becoming more vocal in their desire for independence. But it was still unusual for a woman of Gabrielle's background to strike out on her own. Society expected a young woman with limited means either to marry or serve as a seamstress, laundress, or domestic help. Coco, however, refused to settle. Through a romantic liaison with Etienne Balsan, a wealthy textile heir and horse breeder, she entered a world of lavish parties and well-heeled socialites. Some might say she took advantage of Balsan's generosity, but it was also a matter of survival in an era with few opportunities for orphaned women. And more importantly, that arrangement gave her access to the resources and social circles that would help her future career. By the time she was in her mid-20s, Chanel's life was starting to look more like that of a determined entrepreneur than a simple socialite. She was introduced to Arthur Boy Capel, an English polo player and wealthy businessman who saw something special in her. Capel admired her independence and believed in her ambition. He helped finance her first modest shops, initially in Deauville, then in Biarritz, where she sold hats she designed herself. Though hats might seem like a small detail, they were a perfect starting point for her. They allowed her to experiment with structure, line, and most of all, simplicity. Ladies' hats in that era were typically massive, overly adorned with flowers, feathers, or ribbons. Chanel's hats were stripped down, refined, emphasizing shape over decoration. She was challenging the status quo even as she sewed each ribbon by hand. The interwar period of the 1910s and 1920s saw Chanel's reputation grow. She opened a boutique on Rue Cambon in Paris, near the prestigious Place Vendôme. Here, she began pushing boundaries with women's clothing, championing more relaxed silhouettes that flouted the corseted, tightly cinched figures that still dominated mainstream fashion. She drew inspiration from menswear, adopting jersey fabric, normally reserved for men's undergarments, to craft comfortable, understated dresses and suits for women. It was a radical departure from what was considered stylish. Think about that. In an era where an upper-class woman might change outfits multiple times a day to signal her social position, Chanel offered a single garment that could be worn from morning to evening. The press took notice, labeling her work revolutionary or shockingly plain, depending on the critic's viewpoint. Yet for all her growing success, Coco was dogged by personal heartache. Her beloved Boy Capel died tragically in a car accident in 1919. She was devastated, later telling a friend that in losing him she lost a piece of herself. Though she continued to pour energy into her business, she was often described by acquaintances as distant or guarded. This personal tragedy also led her to focus even more intensively on her work, seeking solace in sketching, designing, and forging new trends. She believed, in her own words, that fashion was one of the ways she could assert her independence in a world that seemed determined to define her by her losses and her relationships. By the 1920s, Chanel's name was synonymous with a new kind of woman, liberated, assured, and no longer weighed down by layers of petticoats. Her creation of the little black dress around 1926 was a watershed moment. At the time, black was primarily associated with mourning attire in Western culture. Yet Chanel's design turned it into a chic, all-purpose garment. Simple lines, short hems. She once said, "A woman can be overdressed but never over-elegant." That philosophy resonated deeply with modern women who were stepping into the workforce, bobbing their hair, and pushing for the right to vote. In terms of Hollywood influence, it didn't take long for the film industry to notice her. As silent cinema gave way to talkies, costume design became an increasingly significant aspect of filmmaking. Hollywood studios like Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and Paramount recognized that a star's wardrobe could become as iconic as the star herself. Rumor has it that a young actress, upon returning from a trip to Paris, raved to her producers about this daring French designer's clothes. Before long, Coco received overtures from top producers who wanted her to dress their leading ladies. According to a widely circulated anecdote, it was Samuel Goldwyn himself who approached Chanel in the early 1930s to bring her style to Hollywood. She traveled to the U.S. and collaborated on wardrobes for major productions, dressing some of the most glamorous actresses of the day. The arrangement was short-lived. Chanel didn't particularly enjoy the Hollywood system, which she felt was too commercial and formulaic, but it served to heighten her international profile. Her garments began gracing the figures of icons like Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich. It was more than just clothing. It was the idea that a woman could be refined yet relaxed, feminine yet powerful. This cross-pollination between Parisian haute couture and Hollywood glamour set off a style revolution that still ripples through the world of film and fashion. By the mid-1930s, Chanel had amassed considerable wealth. She was at the height of her powers. Her brand was global, and a certain mystique clung to her name. She was seen as the ultimate example of a self-made woman, someone who had climbed from an orphanage to rub shoulders with aristocrats, artists, and international celebrities. And yet, for someone who achieved so much, Chanel's life wasn't free of shadows. One of the biggest controversies stems from her activities during the World War II. When the Nazis occupied Paris in 1940, Chanel closed most of her shops, claiming that fashion was not a priority in wartime. But she continued to live at the Hotel Ritz, a favored spot of the occupying German officers. She also became involved with a German intelligence operative named Hans-Günther von Dinklage, fueling accusations that she collaborated with the Nazis. Some historians argue that Chanel used her connections to keep her business interests afloat or to protect herself, while others suggest she was more deeply enmeshed in espionage activities than she ever admitted. Declassified documents, unearthed years later, offered hints that she attempted to act as a spy, using codenames like Westminster, a nod to her prior romantic relationship with the Duke of Westminster. The full extent of her involvement remains a subject of heated debate among biographers. She never stood trial, but the rumors have become a dark cloud that continues to shape her posthumous reputation. Contemporaries who knew her gave conflicting accounts. Some said she was clearly an opportunist, ready to make deals with anyone who would preserve her prestige. Others described a woman terrified by the chaos of war, desperate to maintain a semblance of control over her fate, who clung to a questionable liaison for survival. Regardless of her motivations, once Paris was liberated, Chanel faced the possibility of being branded a collaborator. She left for Switzerland, living in a kind of self-imposed exile for several years. The incident tarnished her image in France. Her reputation took a hit, and it seemed for a time that the Queen of Fashion had lost her kingdom. Many of her old friends distanced themselves, and the French press was quick to cast her as a wartime profiteer, or worse. During these quieter years in Switzerland, Chanel was not married, though she'd had numerous high-profile relationships throughout her life, none of which turned into a stable, lifelong partnership. She reportedly found the idea of marriage restrictive. Perhaps the heartbreak she felt after Arthur Capel's death made her wary of committing fully to anyone else. Perhaps her focus on her empire left little room for the compromises marriage might require. Or maybe she simply valued her autonomy above all else. Friends have said she was complicated in love, protective of her independence, but also deeply wounded by betrayal or loss. While she indulged many romances, including with the Duke of Westminster and other European noblemen, she would eventually return to her solitary routines, poured her energies into her craft, and maintained friendships with a few select confidants, such as the illustrator and designer Jean Cocteau. One intriguing anecdote highlights her continuing influence, even in her Swiss retreat. A friend recounted that during a dinner in Lausanne, Chanel was introduced to an American journalist who had eagerly traveled to Europe, hoping to secure a rare interview. Seated across from Chanel, the journalist mustered the courage to ask, "How does it feel to be dethroned by Christian Dior's new look?" referring to Dior's hugely influential post-war designs that emphasized a cinched waist and full skirt. Chanel responded calmly, "I do not design for the waist or the skirt. I design for the woman." She sipped her wine and left the table. That moment reflected not only her unwavering self-confidence, but also her conviction that her aesthetic was more enduring than mere trends. In 1954, at the age of 71, Chanel staged an audacious comeback in Paris. This was the time when Dior, Balenciaga, and other couturiers dominated the scene with lavish and feminine silhouettes. Chanel's re-entry was met with frosty reviews in France. Critics called her collections outdated, clinging to the 1930s ideals of easy tailoring and minimalistic lines. But the American press, including magazines like Life and Harper's Bazaar, saw something else, a timeless elegance that offered an alternative to the theatrical designs then in vogue. Slowly but surely, Chanel found a new clientele, particularly in the United States, who appreciated her comfortable yet chic suits. Hollywood stars also came knocking, even though she had parted ways with the official film industry collaborations. Individual actresses still wanted that effortless Chanel look. It was a testament to her brand's resilience that, despite the wartime scandals and her advancing age, she could capture the imagination of a whole new generation of fashionable women. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Chanel further cemented her legacy with iconic pieces like the Chanel suit jacket, adorned with braided trim, and of course, the Chanel 2.55 handbag, which featured a shoulder strap, something that was almost revolutionary for women used to carrying bags in their hands. Her No. 5 perfume, launched in 1921, had already become an indispensable accessory for countless Hollywood stars. Marilyn Monroe famously declared that she wore nothing to bed but a few drops of No. 5, a statement that catapulted the fragrance into a new level of global stardom. It's hard to quantify how much that quip boosted the brand's sales, but it certainly underscored Chanel's deep ties to the American film world. Even as she regained the fashion spotlight, Coco remained a guarded and at times abrasive personality. In public, she was witty, snappish, and fearless in her opinions. In private, acquaintances spoke of her bouts of melancholy and a tendency to dwell on the tragedies of her past. She had traveled a long way from the convent orphanage, and while she had conquered the fashion realm, she could never quite outrun her own internal ghosts. She kept her circle small, valuing loyalty and discretion. Some staff at her atelier claimed she would micromanage every last detail of a garment, from the alignment of seams to the selection of the perfect button. If she sensed that her instructions weren't being followed, she didn't hesitate to chastise her workers, often in sharp, cutting terms. That perfectionism contributed to the brand's enduring quality, but also made her a difficult figure to work under. Her later years were marked by this blend of professional triumph and personal solitude. She spent much of her time in her suite at the Hotel Ritz in Paris, the place she had called home on and off since the 1930s. She lived among her favorite furnishings: lacquered Chinese screens, gilded mirrors, and plush sofas. The decor was extravagant for someone who championed simplicity in her garments, but it offered her a sense of comfort and familiarity. She kept designing almost to her last day, overseeing collections and occasionally granting interviews to journalists, intrigued by the living legend. On January 10, 1971, Coco Chanel passed away at the age of 87. The official cause was listed as a heart attack, and she left this world quietly in her Ritz suite, just a short walk from Rue Cambon, where her iconic boutique still stood. News of her death spread quickly, prompting an outpouring of tributes from fashion designers, Hollywood stars, and ordinary women who had embraced her style as an emblem of independence and grace. The funeral at the Église de la Madeleine in Paris was attended by dozens of celebrities, aristocrats, and industry stalwarts, many dressed in Chanel suits as a nod to the woman who had freed them from corsets and fussy trimmings. In the aftermath of her passing, her estate was handled by her close associates, and the Chanel empire continued, though it took some years and a change of creative leadership, most famously under Karl Lagerfeld from the early 1980s onward, to fully expand into the global powerhouse it is today. The brand's success, however, never erased the questions about her wartime conduct. Debate over her alleged collaboration with the Nazis resurfaces periodically, reminding us that icons often have complex histories that do not align neatly with the mythic aura surrounding them. So, why does Coco Chanel's story still resonate? In large part, it's because she embodies a true rags-to-riches journey, fueled by a fiercely independent spirit. She challenged the notion of what women could wear, thereby challenging ideas of what women could do. Before Chanel, the fashion industry basically told women how to present themselves in rigid, class-based uniforms. She gave them comfortable, functional clothing that was still profoundly elegant. This wasn't just a style shift, it was a statement that women's bodies and lives deserved to be respected, not molded and constrained by tradition. In Hollywood, her influence was felt every time a character appeared on screen in sleek, well-tailored silhouettes rather than opulent ball gowns. Her sensibility shaped costume designers' approach to modern storytelling, where practicality and authenticity began to have a place alongside glamour. Her personal life, peppered with heartbreak, scandal, and controversy, also shows us the human cost behind towering success. She lost loved ones, confronted public backlash, and led a private life laced with loneliness. Yet, she persevered, convinced that her vision for women's fashion was not just a fad. And she was right. Though some critics called her designs plain or austere, their timelessness has stood the test of nearly a century. From the black dress worn at a Hollywood premiere to the suits that power women in boardrooms, Chanel's imprint is everywhere. For older viewers today, those who remember the days when Hollywood still had that golden aura, Coco Chanel stands as a link between two worlds. She came from the old Europe of horse-drawn carriages, aristocratic drawing rooms, and convent orphanages, and she became a player in the cinematic dream factory that defined much of the 20th century's cultural imagination. She saw the stage lights of the cabaret, the strobe of paparazzi camera flashes, and the cold glare of political suspicion during the war. Through it all, she found ways to reinvent herself, to remain relevant, and at times to thrive against all odds. And for younger generations or anyone coming across her name for the first time, her life story is a vivid reminder that the icons we see on magazine covers or in brand campaigns didn't simply materialize out of thin air. They often emerge from hardship shaped by historical forces much bigger than themselves. Coco Chanel had to navigate class prejudice, sexism, and the devastation of world wars. She seized opportunities wherever she could find them, sometimes ethically questionable, always deeply personal. In reflecting on her legacy, we have to acknowledge that it's a complicated one. She was a revolutionary designer and a brilliant businesswoman, yet also someone whose actions during a dark moment in history remain difficult to fully reconcile. But perhaps this complexity is part of what makes her story worth telling again and again. She wasn't a flawless heroine in a fairy tale saga. She was a human being shaped by her era, capable of both inspiring millions and provoking moral outrage. When we think about Coco Chanel, we can't help but be reminded of the labyrinth of choices that define every life, especially one lived so publicly. By the time of her death, Chanel had outlived many of her contemporaries and many of her rivals, leaving behind a fashion house that would carry on her name long after she was gone. The brand's interlocking CC logo, introduced during her lifetime, became one of the world's most recognized emblems, rivaling the brand power of Hollywood studios themselves. The legend of Coco Chanel, sometimes overshadowing the real Gabrielle Chanel, only grew with each retelling, each exhibit, each wave of new Chanel collections and fragrances. And perhaps that's the final lesson for all of us. Stories like hers persist because they tap into something universal. We admire her audacity, her vision, her willingness to break rules, and stand firm in a world that often dismisses women's creativity. At the same time, we wrestle with her moral compromises, her dubious alliances, and the personal cost of her success. Coco Chanel, in all her contradictions, shows us that greatness and imperfection frequently coexist, that forging a path forward can mean leaving controversies in one's wake. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up. Let us know your thoughts in the comments section and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.